My god, the work I had to do for this video was a lot more than I expected. Like, I knew Silksong was gonna be dense with content, but here I am sitting with over 50 hours of game time when I was expecting like 16. Alright, so Hollow Knight and Hollow Knight Silksong, a couple of games that have been recommended to me as the greatest Metroidvanias ever made, by a grand total of 2 people. I've been seeing an unholy amount of glaze about these 2 games over the internet, and especially on Reddit. Now, I do not take Reddit very seriously, it is a very unhappy place. Is that true? I profoundly don't know. The sample size of Metroidvanias I completed is way too small to even give a valid opinion on literally the entirety of the genre. The games I completed would include Hollow Knight and Hollow Knight Silksong and Metroid Dread, and add to that just a tiny bit of Blasphemous, which for some reason refused to let me capture any footage for a while, but I managed to get it just in time for this video. I haven't completed the game, but there's also like a bit of a blur in my mind. There were a bunch of games I remember being Metroidvanias now that I think back on them, but I was way too young to remember them, to be honest with you, so I'm not sure exactly what I was playing. Just to give you a rundown in case you've never played a Metroidvania, the name comes from Metroid and Castlevania, which were developed by Nintendo and Konami respectively. Both of these games released in 1986 for the NES, and the core premise behind the Metroidvania has kind of become flexible given literally almost 40 years of the genre being around. Add to that the alternate spins that have been done with the series and the franchise and the genre as a whole. But as practically a complete amateur to the genre, I will say that the core idea is that you're dropped into one large interconnected map that you're meant to explore and complete objectives in, so you can finish an overarching objective like escape, or something that could change according to plot developments. Now, exploring the map you're placed in is the most important element, since there would be a lot of hidden pathways that you can break through that would need your attention, and you'd go on to unlock new abilities so you can backtrack to reach collectibles in areas you couldn't access before. And you're not given exact objectives or locations to get to, because the exploration itself is non-linear, so you can take on it in any order you might feel like, except for maybe the start of the game. Those will usually have like a specific path you're meant to follow before the entire game opens up to you. The original Metroid from '86 was so complicated that you had practically no chance to beat the game without a guide or your friend's help, since there was an extremely high number of breakable paths with absolutely no visual indication that you could blow them open. Like, what is this I'm looking at here, man? And Castlevania kinda shares a similar gameplay formula while surrounding the game in a way that almost makes it look like a painting. There's a bunch of good videos that cover the work Ayami Kojima had done for the series, and it's just stunning and beautiful to look at all the way through. I know I hadn't played Castlevania, but I've got a friend who's a fan. You know who you are. How you doing, buddy? In terms of how combat is in those games, it's usually focused more on your ability to navigate around the map and its enemies, so the bosses will have you constantly moving around the arena to avoid taking damage. But other games can focus on your ability to put together builds to give you more freedom in combat. That being said, I think I gave a pretty okay rundown of what the genre actually is, and any further explanation will take up more time than what we need to explore the definition of the genre. But just to cap off this section, here are some notable Metroidvanias. Obviously, Metroid, Castlevania, Blasphemous, that new Prince of Persia game, Dead Cells, and moving on to our topic of discussion today, Hollow Knight and Hollow Knight Silksong. The Hollow Knight games have been crowned as indie sweethearts of the Metroidvania genre. Add to that, they're also sweethearts of gaming and indie gaming, just people really do like these games, man. So the Hollow Knight games won over a lot of players' hearts, with the quality and the volume of content that's offered in those games, and they go on sale very frequently. The amount of content actually threw me off, especially in Silksong, where I thought I'd just be spending 25 Canadian dollars to get like 18 hours of playtime, but in the end I got like 60 hours of playtime out of it, which is unprecedented, to be honest. It's kind of unbelievable for an indie game to do that. There's one thing we need to get out of the way, and that's the fact that these games were made with an abundance of love and faith in the project, and Team Cherry was just a team of 3 Aussies going after their dreams. Long story short, they raised money through a Kickstarter campaign, and they brought in about 59,000 Australian dollars or 39,000 American dollars, and just for 10 years of inflation yourself, because I'm not doing that. They put the game together, it launched on Steam, and as of August 2025, it reached a marvelous number of 15 million copies sold across all platforms, which is quite the return on investment. Basically, and in theory, these guys didn't need to make another game again, but sheer love of the game and money brought them back with a bigger team for the next project, Hollow Knight Silksong. Okay, so Hollow Knight opens up through introducing you to Hallownest, where you, the knight, are drawn back to this kingdom inhabited by bugs. You start in Dirtmouth, which acts as a hub area for you to get hold of upgrades to help you in navigating Hallownest, which includes maps and markers for it, in addition to a compass. These items can't be stressed enough, since on a first playthrough I practically think these are mandatory since you really don't want to get lost. But there's a pretty big comparison that we've yet to cover about the premise of the game as a whole, and it's quite literally that it's a Souls-like Metroidvania. And this isn't even a brave comparison to make. Now, to compare the games to a Souls-like, this would drag us into another tangent where I would explain another game genre for people who might know it, since it's a lot more popular, but I'll keep it brief through introducing a mechanic in Hollow Knight, and then showing the Dark Souls parallel. Benches are bonfires, and these are the areas where you can rest and heal your health, and they act as a save point and a break from the combat and platforming. We also have the soul recovery mechanic, which allows you to go and collect your lost resources in the form of Geo, which is a currency that allows you to buy upgrades. The runbacks from bosses could also be another element that's challenging to players. Finally, there's the actual premise of the game, which is you going through a kingdom that is facing a threat under infection, which will plague and corrupt the place. And then there's the way that the story is told with barely any cutscenes, with a lot of the information and world building being done through the characters you speak to and the environments you explore. The setting and atmosphere kind of feels similar to each other in some ways, but I won't attribute that to being a Souls thing. It would be kind of disingenuous to criticize that or feel like I have to point it out. It's just something that they both share. The developers of the game stated that they hadn't really played much Dark Souls, and they attributed the similarities of the games and how it turned out to the influences that they drew from both of them. But in all honesty, like, from my own personal opinion, saying that Hollow Knight is nothing like a Souls game is either downplaying their simulators too much, or it goes as far as rage bait when you really think about it. Now, to move on to the actual experience of the game, I'll keep it brief since there's a lot to cover and I'm not really a Hollow Knight channel. So if you want more intricate videos that detail Hollow Knight for you, I'm sure there's a lot of videos over the course of 7 years since the release of the game at this point that cover the lore and history pretty well. The atmosphere of the game is pretty charming with the fun creature designs and honestly that kind of adorable bug designs. Just look how cute and marketable. Let's turn them into some magnets. But it's also really melancholy. I think a moment that really spoke to that is the first time I entered the City of Tears and the soundtrack that was in the background at that point as I sat on the bench while the rain was hitting the glass. This was a pretty calming moment in between all the times I felt overwhelmed by how difficult the game was getting, or something else of the sort at the time. I kind of forgot, I'll be honest. And in all honesty, I'm expecting a lot of get good comments if this video reaches an experienced player base. The story does have a bit of a cast that adds more character to it, which is something unusual for Metroidvania, since those experiences are usually pretty solitary and they don't have you talk to people that much. But Hollow Knight introduces a few characters that are not front and center in terms of the story, but it adds a lot more to the characterization of the— okay, fine, I'll stop. Music in the game is usually on the somber and softer side, but it ramps up when you step into combat to reflect that. Additionally, the sound design in the game is pretty well done, since the sound cues for enemy attacks are the clearest thing you'll hear if they're off screen, which puts you on edge since you don't really want to do those runbacks. But also the silence in the environment helps keep things from giving you any sensory overload, which keeps you focused and maintains the somber atmosphere of the game. The exploration of the game is kind of relaxing, save for this one zone where it's admittedly pretty creepy. The environments you go through also have a good variety of color palettes, although I'll be honest, one thing I struggle with is remembering specific rooms in those regions, since the regions themselves are kind of uniform in nature, so I wasn't able to make any mental waypoints in my head to know where I'm going. The brighter colors pop even more later on in the game, since there's a lot of darker environments that kind of had my eyes glued to the screen. And this is where the power of that almighty OLED screen kind of comes in, because those are really nice to have. Looking at it objectively, the controls in the game are responsive and simple, but once you start the game, the movement in combat might feel stiff since you start with basic movement. You start with a jump and then the slash, and then later on you get a hold of a few abilities that amplify the gameplay like the dash and double jump. But I feel like we're stuck with the starting moveset for far too long, and the dash should have been introduced earlier on in the game. You aren't given a map by default or a simple go here kind of objective, which could push away a lot of players since games nowadays love throwing obvious objectives to you. They also tried to do this to maintain an increasingly decreasing attention span. So that's kind of tragic in all honesty, but once you're over that and you start getting over objectives, the game picks up and it feels a lot better to play, and you can actually start enjoying the game. Platforming in the game will depend on how high or low you want to jump, so a shorter tap on your controller will just cause you to skip, and the press will mean a longer jump. You as the player are granted full control to screw up or make the platforming as precise as you want, with also being given some air control to make adjustments on where you're going. Later on, you'll also learn that pogo hopping is pretty helpful and it becomes a vital part of combat and platforming. One other thing we can appreciate is the environmental design, making the background and foreground clear, and the playable spaces clearly defined to you. A lot of 2D games get this wrong, but Hollow Knight has a good sense of depth to establish these environments, and it really adds to the immersion. Another criticism I have for the game is just not allowing the player to know where they are by default. I feel like that's kind of restricting in all honesty, since charms are pretty fun to experiment with, and it discourages it since I'm faced with a dilemma of trading off my ability to know where I am, what objective I'm going after. In essence, the question boils down to, do you want to know where you are and where you're going, or do you want to complete a specific type of build to do more damage and test out new abilities? This is kind of a big risk to take on the developer's part, because you could risk somebody not liking the game enough to come back and replay it and memorize the map and test out new builds. So it could be a failed question in the end, you know, a bit of a pointless one. Additionally, runbacks to bosses could either use more benches so you don't get placed at a terrible spot with a bad amount of platforming that brings you back at a disadvantage, or there's also maybe the placement of boss checkpoints that could be very helpful to reducing my headaches. The Soulmaster in particular is a boss that gave me a hard time, since he had a bunch of gimmicky tactics that threw me off and would have had me throw on my controller if I played the game on launch. There are trade-offs to implementing these, and it might take away from the achievement of actually getting through the bosses, since you have to survive the runbacks and then actually beat the boss. But who knows, maybe I'm whining too much since I've only completed the game once after all. I want to take a second to actually speak on the final boss of Hollow Knight. Now, I know that the Radiance is categorized as the actual final boss, but I'm actually a huge fan of the original Hollow Knight boss fight and the music that goes along with this fight and the premise and the story. It's kind of touching, but I think a lot about this boss fight. So to conclude the section where I'm reviewing Hollow Knight, I think it's a really good game, and its story and the characters are really understated, which I really enjoy since it leaves it to you to figure things out by yourself. The world is super charming to explore, the music is great, the atmosphere is marvelous, and it leaves you with a lot of great moments along the way that just have you smiling despite how melancholy the world is. But at the end of it all, there is hope through how challenging it is. Okay, fine, I'm sorry, I'm done now. Moving on to Silksong, this game had been waited on for years by fans, and finally here we are, about 2 presidential elections later. Sprinkle onto that a series of events happening around the world and on the news that literally came out of a Black Ops campaign. Add on to that the world adding more surveillance features than ever that make me want to move off the grid, because freaking AI is being injected into everything at this point. Anyways, Hollow Knight Silksong was initially planned to be an expansion for Hollow Knight to just be added on as a DLC. Eventually the scope of the expansion grew since Team Cherry saw that, well, they made a crazy amount of money off of Hollow Knight, so they might as well expand into a complete game, and so the fanbase was set on fire again. And then the wait began. Given the first game took 4 years to develop since the Kickstarter campaign, this new game would now take 7 years to complete. Obviously the wait was long and arduous, and I know what it's like to wait on a game for a specific amount of time with hardly any information coming out in the meantime. But this worked to the game's advantage since it created a space where fans can speculate and talk about the game and what they want out of it. During that period, more players would be introduced to Hollow Knight, and the game would sell an astronomical amount of copies like I mentioned earlier. The lemons grow really nicely in the summer. Lemonade is my favorite drink, it's really refreshing. Hey, you still with me? Okay, I'm just checking, my bad. Anyways, you get the idea. The anticipation behind Silksong's release was massive, and it spawned a community of maniacs who create memes and hype up the game, which is just free marketing at that point, and the best kind because players profoundly cared about the game. And they cared so much that Steam's web store had been broken on launch day, and so were other storefronts like Epic and maybe Xbox and PlayStation, also Nintendo. But I'm smart. I bought it off GOG. Nobody buys off GOG. So remember everything I said earlier about Hollow Knight? So all of that applies to Silksong as well. The core idea behind this bit of the review is that Silksong is just Hollow Knight with a ramped up production value and a remarkably raised up standard of quality that you can really feel. And there's one thing I want to admit here, and it's the fact that I bought Silksong before I grabbed Hollow Knight because my brother asked me to, so if it weren't for him I wouldn't have done it. but he didn't even play the thing. So I bought Hollow Knight so I can kind of get a better idea of the games, and I usually hate skipping the first game of the series, especially if it's just 2 and there's a clear point to start. Eventually I found out that he didn't play the game because he didn't play Hollow Knight, so who knows, maybe eventually he'll pick it up too. But yeah, Silksong is a huge upgrade over Hollow Knight, visually, sonically, and how it controls, and the production overall, and really importantly, the complexity of its bosses and its gameplay. So again, if we go back to Dark Souls, in terms of comparing Hollow Knight to that, the gameplay is usually done one way, and that's the focus on the melee combat. Silksong would compare to Elden Ring in its gameplay because of the sheer amount of options and the flexibility that you get. The big factor that differentiates it is the change they introduced to the down slash. The down slash attack had been changed from a vertical attack to a diagonal attack, which kind of introduces an element of challenge since you now have to know where you're going to land. This becomes important in combat if you actually want to hit your targets, and it even becomes a big factor in platforming. Crests are the item that dictate this, and they change the direction of your slash. So you start with the Hunter Crest by default, and that's your diagonal slash. Additionally, they also affect the attacks and the moveset that you have while you're on the ground. Then eventually you can unlock the Wanderer Crest, which literally brings back the traditional vertical slash from Hollow Knight, which makes pogoing a lot easier. There's also the Beast Crest, which I think sucks, or I don't know how to play with it, but there are a bunch of them that you can collect from chapels across the map, and you can use them to change how you play, in addition to Silk abilities that replace the Soul Meter from the first game. I forgot to mention this, but the Soul Meter can also be used for healing and to unleash different attacks, ranged attacks, and even melee attacks. The game offers a surprising amount of depths, and the options that you get are kind of dizzying when you think about it. There's a lot you can do with this game's combat options. This isn't really a build channel, so the crest I primarily worked with is the Wanderer crest because I'm bad at the game. No further questions, please. While these changes are all fine, I still got a bunch of complaints about the game now that the scope had been raised. With a game as expansive as this, I think they were incredibly stingy as to not introduce the dash earlier in the game, especially since the game's opening is incredibly slow. That's a lot slower than Hollow Knight, which I did not like. The game's opening is quite boring looking back at it, and it doesn't really get that good until the end of the first act, which is a really big risk that they took, and it could have lost a lot of players. But once it opens up, you're gonna suffer even more because you're more nimble, more powerful overall, and you get more flexibility in combat, and you're gonna make sure that you actually use all that flexibility in a fight. But I think Team Cherry did something stupid, and because they knew a lot of people would be playing this game, so they had to somehow cater to the old players who were potentially gonna call the game easy, and the other players who are just gonna give up because they're bad and have no game sense. Silksong is a bit of a victim of its own hype, since it brought along a lot of potential new fans to the franchise that haven't really played Hollow Knight and don't really have the attention span to actually go pick up the first game and might think it's like too janky or whatever, too unrefined. So it kind of dilutes the fan base, and you don't have enough people that kind of appreciate the changes that Silksong has over the original game. I think it's potentially a problem that we could have. I personally don't think you can expect to play Silksong and expect an easy start, even though that opening boss is stupidly easy. Like, that was way too easy. But I think that was just designed for people who have never played any video games before, to be honest. There's no way that was actually designed with players in mind. But a little bit further into that opening act, there's a clear hike in difficulty from what you're expected to do in the beginning of Hollow Knight from what you're expected to do from the beginning of Silksong in those earlier bosses and encounters. For one, the enemies take off 2 health points of damage just to compensate for the fact that you can heal 3 points at a time in comparison to Hollow Knight's gradual healing. Basically, you expend your soul meter a little bit slower to heal like a more specific amount, but with Silksong it's quicker and you heal 3 points, and that's like the fixed amount that they give you. The difficulty of the game is set up so that for every new capability that Hornet has over the little knight, there's always a counterbalance to make sure that it isn't the most overpowered thing ever. So for example, healing can be done in midair, it gives you back 3 points and it's generally faster. But if you get hit, you're going to lose the entirety of that bar, you'll also lose your health, and you'll be very prone to dying within the next few seconds. And the healing activity, while it is quicker, it uses the entire bar, so it's not like you can gradually just expend it. Getting good at the combat in Silksong is a lot harder since you don't just have to worry about your moveset to deal damage against enemies. Your enemies also have more sophisticated movesets, so you'll have to familiarize yourself with them, and also the new tool feature since throwables are a thing now and you need to learn how they work to deal more damage. While they are a pretty good new feature, I am also going to acknowledge that they're optional, so there is a lot of player choice there, in terms of combat at least. I personally really welcome this difficulty curve since it doesn't really compromise on what the developers intended for the player to experience. And if all of us go through the same thing, then we can all know that there isn't an easy mode that waters down the experience since all of us played it the same way. It's kind of like you and your friends taking a standardized test, or any test for that matter, and then discussing what we answered for the specific questions, you know? But I have a complaint specifically about the Girl the Great boss fight in the Bilewater region of the map, since that run back was absolutely horrendous. We do not need to go through a platforming section and then beat an arena full of difficult enemies every time we want to take a stab at beating the boss fight. That section of the map and that whole region kind of just made my blood boil really hot. It was miserable. Bilewater as a region is just designed to frustrate you at every point imaginable, and I was so irritated playing the area I completely forgot to gather any footage of how bad it is, but you can just search it up yourself. I am okay. But just imagine being faced with droves of maggots that eat at your silk, gross monsters that puke on you whenever you're in range, and you're supposed to go up against Girl the Great after everything I just described. It's miserable. It's really bad. Going through Bilewater made me regret the fact that I didn't refund the game earlier. It was really miserable, to be honest with you. I did not like that area at all. Like, I could have been playing something else at that point, and it took out all my energy for that. Additionally, even in the early game, some creatures take like 3 or 4 hits to take out, but that just doesn't make sense. Like, why is the game introducing such tanky basic enemies from the jump? Like, maybe there's a bit of an argument where you can play devil's advocate and kind of just say like, oh, maybe they just gave him this much health to say like, you don't need to attack everything, so you can explore the map or whatever, and you could use some of these enemies to platform, you know, so they give you a couple more chances rather than having to reset the area or whatever. But I think that doesn't even make sense either, because a lot of these enemies are just on the ground, you know? I personally have a lot of patience and I was willing to tough it out all the way through, but a lot of people might not be able to, and I don't say this from a get good elitist perspective. Referring back to the Girl the Great boss fight, I think it's bad game design that you have to beat the arena every time. Like, we already proved that we can beat this arena once. I don't think we need to do it again, because it's just miserable. Like, it was actually so bad. Apparently the game was a lot more difficult closer to launch, but I've completed the game a couple months after, and I'm playing the more manageable version now apparently, so yeah, that's weird. Another problem that persisted with me was my failure to make mental waypoints and remembering exactly where I was. And the problem of not having a compass by default is still there. Like, I still think that's genuinely annoying. If you run through the game a second time, things will feel a lot easier since runs get more optimized the more and more you play, but I'm personally not going to do that since I plan on playing more games for new videos. Moving on to the next point about the game, the atmosphere. This game is a lot more visually vibrant than Hollow Knight, and the variety in environments in Farland really adds to the experience. The music and the art direction is of a higher quality since you can just tell that they had a far bigger budget for this game, and I don't feel like any of it was wasted. A big point I want to bring forward is that Silksong has become a benchmark in quality that allows players to gauge the price that they're paying for a game. Why would I buy a copy of Borderlands 4 when I could buy 3 copies of Silksong? Silksong undercharges and over-delivers, which is why so many AAA studios are freaking terrified of it. They keep saying, oh, Silksong and Expedition 33 are abnormalities. Shut the f up. Please, your game sucks. And even if a AAA studio releases a successful game, you know those layoffs are coming just so they can deprive people of their bonuses. Additionally, the game is super accessible and practically any hardware can run it, and even your dishwasher can run it as well too. The game does not get your computer to run hotter than a blue star because it's not being done with Unreal Engine 5. I've whined about at least like 3 games using Unreal Engine 5 this year, or at least since the start of me doing long-form content on this channel. The art direction they went with allows them to run the game on anything, and it accomplishes exactly what they need because they have a specific vision they want to present. Speaking of art direction, you freaking fan artists are actually bugging. Hornet is literally just a spider. What is your problem? How do you come up with this? Like, it's literally just a stick figure. So how do you get yourself to draw this? Are you insane? Any further and I'm gonna get swatted by YouTube for not censoring my video. Like, this is the worst of it, I promise. The bug has thirst traps. What? Hornet was established as a character in the original game, so her character had to be fleshed out in a specific way that was consistent with what they did in the original game, and also kind of expands on it, obviously, you know, given that this is a sequel. and I think the writing does a good job continuing the story and developing her. While it isn't explicitly mentioned, the way that you cover the events of the game kind of implies some subtle storytelling, depending on how many side quests that you tackle and the way that you kind of build up Hornet in the game. And that's something I whine about a lot when it comes to this channel. I just can't shut up about subtlety for a good reason. Exploration and finding items and upgrades in the game is just much more interesting than what you did in Silksong. Finding stuff doesn't just feel like you're progressing that character and what she can do, it comes with a bit more intrigue that just wasn't there with Hollow Knight in all honesty. Anyways, back to how the game looks, it maintains a lot of the charm of the original Hollow Knight, but it doesn't look as gloomy. There's a stronger sense of life in Farloom in comparison to Hallownest, and the game presents you with an option to save it. While Hallownest kind of felt like a tragic story of like a dying kingdom. The color palette overall is just much bolder since they don't use darker colors for the environments as much, since the first area that you start in is like lush green. You move on to explore a range of other environments later on. The scale of the maps feel more expansive than Hallownest, with the backdrops having larger buildings and structures rather than just being tighter with claustrophobic rooms. There's a sense of grandeur and something majestic about the environment to reflect the fact that this is a more active kingdom than Hallownest, and even the character and enemy designs are changed to reflect that. But even with all these changes, you can still definitely tell that this is a Hollow Knight game, and it's just, you know, made of the same fabric that players will know, and it'll feel right at home for them. Another achievement they did was the expectations around the price point that they presented being changed up, like for what they were able to do. Now, I hate to make things about the money, but ladies and gentlemen, it's always going to be about the money when it comes to video games with AAA developers. But Silksong has released for the lower price of $25, which is $5 more than what Hollow Knight originally launched for. And even with the price hike, while accounting for inflation from 7 years ago, it apparently only went up 11 cents in price, which is insane to me. Finally, I want to give Team Cherry their flowers for doing such a bang-up job with the game overall, despite potentially aging me like 7 years in the process with Bilewater. You've made an amazing equalizer with the game you've put out, and I want the lesson for the dear viewer watching this to be, when you see a AAA game that looks okay-ish and is coming from a neglectful developer, just think of how many Silksongs you could have bought with that money. Better yet, go donate it to somebody who actually needs it. Now, another big question we're all faced with for the end of the year is what game of the year is going to be, you know? I'm gonna be honest, I doubt it's Silksong. I'm gonna give that to Expedition 33. But if it weren't for Expedition 33, I think a bunch of other awards would be scattered throughout the gaming industry right now. And that also goes to Silksong. I think it could also take Game of the Year if it weren't for Expedition 33. Another game in consideration could probably be Donkey Kong Bonanza, but I think that not enough people have played that game. I've seen a lot of people sell off their devices on Marketplace, so there's probably quite the buyer's remorse going around when it comes to this console. But that's okay since I was able to get mine real cheap, and now I can catch up on and cover Nintendo content. There's also Ghost of Yotei, which I doubt anybody's gonna take seriously, but there's also Death Stranding 2, which I haven't played because I don't have a PS5. Doom: The Dark Ages very unfortunately missed the mark for me, as it's just a pairing game and I couldn't get myself to beat the game in a few sittings. A couple other games of note that I haven't played would be Elden Ring Night Rain, Arc Raiders, which Shroud set to vote as Game of the Year because he wanted multiplayer games to win something, which... are you daft? Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 I think is too niche, but there's also Split Fiction, which a lot of my friends were having a lot of fun with. And finally Hades 2, which seems real good, but in all honesty I'm kind of ashamed to admit this, but I never played the original Hades all the way. Another game I've been wanting to speak on before the year ends, or I hope I can put out a review for it, would be Chronos: The New Dawn, since I've been having a lot of fun with that as a survival horror game, so I'm excited to share that with you guys. And for my first Nintendo video, I decided that I wouldn't be doing a Pokemon video for it because I never actually played a Pokemon game, and I don't know where to start, especially with the Switch games since they all look so underproduced. And if I were to play Pokemon Legends ZA at full price, it'll just feel like I'm hate playing, since literally only thing that looks good in that game are the character models, and the walls are just JPEGs, you know? Switch Pokemon game fans are worse than Disney adults, since they can't get themselves to criticize the game that they play and say like, hey, you guys are putting way too little effort into this, you know? They just go like, oh, it's fun, you know? Their Stockholm Syndrome actually needs to be studied. But I'm excited to share what I think of Metroid Dread and Metroid Prime ahead of the release of Metroid Prime 4 Beyond. Wow, that's a mouthful. Which I expect to have made a video on it, I think, after the end of the year, but it depends on how badly I'm getting messed up by exams, so we'll see about that. I've always wanted to get into Metroid and I took my shot, and I've become a pretty huge fan since I beat Dread, and I'm baffled that not more people have been into the series since Nintendo managed to put a Switch into practically every household since 2017.
Samus? Samus Aran? Hey! Hey, Samus Aran! Oh, stop! Calm down! Oh.
I am remarkably concerned now. Oh my god. I think a beautiful thing I realized while I was gaming, especially this year because I played a bunch of really good games, is that I don't need to play any garbage games. I only choose to play trash games because it's mildly funny to me and I want to have something to be irrationally angry thinking back on. Anger and hate are quite a motivator, and yes, it is not that good for my wallet. Anyways, I've rambled on for far too long and I delivered today's life lesson, which doesn't just apply to video games. Remember that you're not a consumer, you're a customer. Value your time properly and only do business with those who care about what they make and who they make it for. Thanks for watching, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you on the next one.